welcome to another video in the series Archaeology and Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and today I want to start addressing the topic of the archaeology of the prophets. I'm calling this video Nomads and Archaeology. Now, I find that there are different kinds of people when it comes to the prophets. This is true of both Muslims and non-Muslims. There are those who believe in the prophets. There are those who wonder and doubt and are maybe just ignorant. There are those who are too busy to care. And there are those who refuse to believe without evidence. Many of those who refuse to believe are the most vocal. They are often bitterly opposed and say all kinds of derogatory things. Often they mix up hearsay with facts, thinking that those who believe in prophets are all the same. In the next 6 videos, we're going to look at the archaeology of the prophets. We will discuss the archaeological evidence of 8 prophets in 6 videos. These will include Job, Moses, Abraham, David and Solomon, Isaiah, and Hud and Salah. But first, don't be fooled by people who doubt. You do not have to prove that the prophets existed. The lives of the prophets have been believed and accepted for several thousand years by Jews, by Christians, and by Muslims. I think the doubters and the deniers, they need to prove that the prophets did not exist. And that's a different challenge. Now listen, here's how the argument goes. I do not believe that the prophet David existed. I will only believe if you can prove he existed. Now, how do you answer that kind of a challenge? What is acceptable evidence? In this type of discussion, it is important to understand that what the other side is thinking. If someone tells me that he doubts that David existed because there is scant archaeological evidence for this great kingdom of his, I usually ask them, what sort of kingdom are you talking about? Remember that Abraham was a nomad. After they went into Egypt to escape the famine, the children of Israel were nomads living in the land of Goshen, tending cattle and sheep. They did this for several hundred years. It was only at the very end when they were forced into labor, but the wives and the families still lived in tents. We know this because they came out of Egypt and they came with their tents. Later, we know that during the time of the Exodus, they were still nomads living in tents, Exodus 12. And during the time that they slowly conquered the land of Canaan, and after they took over the land of Canaan, they were still nomads. They didn't mind burning and destroying the cities of Canaan because they lived in tents. Heber, the Kenite, and his tribe separated themselves from Israel, and they moved their tents, indicating that they were tent-dwelling pastoralists. That's in Judges 4. Some of the tribes that they absorbed were also nomads and hewers of wood and water, etc. There's no indication that they were settled. Note that none of the captives that they captured, these tribes, were hewers of stone or haulers of stone. Listen, do you know what it says in Judges about Deborah, the ruler of Israel? She judged from under a tree, typical of a nomad. In Judges 4, there is Sisera is fleeing from his enemies, and he runs to the tent of Heber, and Heber's wife kills him with a tent peg. During the time of Gideon, the armies returned home from battle to their tents. That's in Judges 7. And there was constant strife between the Israelites and the city dwellers, who are almost always portrayed as evil. Just as in the story of the Benjamite and his concubine, it is mentioned that Israel lived in tents, Judges 20, but the city is evil. During the time of Samuel, the people lived in tents, 1 Samuel chapter 4. And Saul travels many miles in search of his father's donkeys, indicating they were pastoralists in 1 Samuel 9. Now, some settlements seem to have come with Saul when he was appointed as king, and so he was building up his armies, and so there was some settlement of people, but this was after 1,000 years of being nomad. But King David, he was a pastoralist in his youth, 1 Samuel 17. And there are many references to the cities of the Philistines and the cities of Canaan, but there are very few references to cities in Israel outside of the cities of refuge, which are actually small towns with walls, not great cities. However, as the Israelites settled, they become involved with the gods of the settled people, and this was preached against. During the rebellion of Bichri, people still lived in tents. That's in 2 Samuel 22. For far too long, people have gotten their ideas of history from artists who drew pictures. Those artists lived in the West, and they drew pictures that would make sense to settled people. Remember, King David had no city in his kingdom large enough for his capital city, so he took it from the Jebusites. That was a people group that had Jerusalem. It belonged to another people. And David brought his fighting men and they conquered the city. Remember, this is already in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, and the people still living in tents. Even after David had a capital city and he had built himself a house, a notable event in the biblical record, but the temple of God was still in a tent, 1 Chronicles 15. It even tells us that David and Solomon had to build cities to house the people and his chariots. When Solomon decided to give King Hiram of Tyre 20 cities in the land of Galilee, presumably it was in payment for timber and the gold that King Hiram had sent Solomon. But when Hiram saw the cities, he was very disappointed. He was expecting cities, and all he got was dirty small villages. 1 Kings 9. So David's son Solomon, he built a number of so-called cities so he could keep his horses and his chariots, but he did not assign existing cities because he wanted to build new cities, or was it because there was insufficient cities of any size to house the horses and the people that he was building for? During the time of the reign of Joash and Amaziah, many people still lived in tents. That's 2 Chronicles 25. So if you're looking for a large empire with public buildings and temples, it did not exist. There's no record of David ever building great cities and public buildings or even a single temple. The temple was still in a tent. You see, Israel was not like Egypt. Israel was not like Babylon. It was not like Assyria. It was not even like the Hittites. So when people claim there is no archaeological evidence for the Israelite nation, they're probably looking for something and expecting something that isn't there. So don't let them fool you when they say there's no evidence. So let's think about the archaeological footprint that nomads leave. I lived for years in southern Jordan and lived among nomads. I regularly visited their tents, I sat with them, I ate with them, and I tried to learn about life from a nomadic perspective because I wanted to understand the history of the Nabateans who came as nomads. I learned a few things while I was there. First, nomads regularly move their tents. They don't stay in the same spot year after year. Remember, they go a short distance away from the tent to use an open toilet. The animals all gather around the tent and they leave their droppings. So after a few months like this, they like to move their tent to a clean location. They might return to that same old spot several years later, but once the dung has dried up and once the soil has changed again, then they can go back to that spot. So what sort of archaeological evidence will these nomads leave behind? Very little. Now, there were lots of small towns. Here's a satellite photo of a small town that appears to date back to the Iron Age, but no archaeologists have ever studied it and have fully dated it. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these sites in Israel and in Jordan. Today they're just piles of stone, but in ancient times, over 1,000 people may have lived there. The houses were built around in a circle, so the outer walls of the houses formed the wall. and all around it people would continue living as nomads, but that would be the city. Even markets become nomadic, with markets moving around from location to location. About 6 miles from where we lived and from where that ruined town was that we just saw, there was a market on Thursdays in an open field. When there was no market on, you could not tell what that field was used for. But on Thursday, visiting merchants showed up with their booths, usually just a piece of cloth on the ground with their wares piled on top of it. Local people brought in their produce, their agricultural produce. At the end of the day, it was all cleaned up and the market moved on to another town, and there was very little archaeological footprint left behind. Another thing to consider is that most of the tools that the nomads used are biodegradable. They're made of wood or leather, bits of bone, things like this. Here's a loom. So when something is thrown out, it usually just disintegrates. If they had metal objects, they usually reuse them or recycle them into something else. The only implements that remain are stone tools. And this brings us to another interesting anomaly. The early archaeologists did surveys of what they found on the surface. Albright, the founder of biblical archaeology, Malin, who dug at Rasul, and Gluck, who discovered the Nabateans. These three are all known for their Transjordan surveys published from 1925 to 1951. There was a problem, however, these surveys. That none of these surveys included any excavations. Instead, they all relied entirely on surface findings. Now, because Iron Age pottery dominated the surface landscape, Albright concluded that Iron Age people were the initial settlers on the Transjordan side, all except for when excavations were happening. Malin revisited the same sites as Albright, and more of them. He came to the same conclusion about the Iron Age peoples being the original settlers there. Gluck relied heavily on the work of his predecessors, and he added more sites, and he too echoed Albright's original conclusion about the initial settlers being Iron Age. In 1951, Albright published his book, The Archeology of Palestine. He included a map of Palestine with a dearth of sites in it. It wasn't until 1976 that Khair Yassin catalogued over 120 sites in the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, far more than the previous surveys. He noted different types of pottery. He saw early bronze sites, and he started finding intermediate bronze sites from the different unfortified agricultural places. He noticed in the fortified places extensive medium age bronze sites, and he noticed this in the villages. But the late Bronze Age presence was missing from the Jordan Valley, especially near Wadi Zerka. So some of these were abandoned during Iron Age too as well. Despite all of this new information, none of it was published, none of it made it back into maps. In fact, I'm not sure any of his findings were published at all. In conclusion, they all came to the same conclusion, that Iron Age people dominated the scene. This is often reinforced by people today doing ground surveys. I once took a respectable archaeologist to some sites that no one else had been to before. On the way, he noticed some flint tools on the ground, and he was excited about them and how good shape they were in after centuries of lying there. I was shocked. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything, but that's because a week or two before, I was with some nomads on that very same spot, and they used some stone tools for cleaning the skins of animals. Afterwards, they just sort of threw them away. They didn't need them. Nomads don't carry around stone tools. They just leave them in the field. They just drop them there, and they can always come back if they're in that area again and get those tools. But the archaeologists assumed that the stone tools were from many years ago, and so that just reinforces the ideas of those earlier archaeologists. Even today, I hear historians quoting from earlier ideas, saying there's no evidence of people there. They throw doubt on the biblical record. Here's a photo of archaeologists from Brown University doing a ground survey. Now, no matter how extensive ground surveys may be, there's no digging going on. There's no excavation. We need to have excavation. Now, thankfully, the archaeologists from Brown University are doing just that. I'm not complaining about them. I'm very happy when archaeologists start digging. Today, archaeologists are doing a great job on many different sites, but their funds and their personnel are limited. And so we still have only a very partial picture of the history of Israel, and especially what's east of the Jordan River. The result is that virtually every student of history in this whole region is woefully ignorant of the rich and thriving culture that occupied the area in the intermediate and the Middle Bronze ages. So it's only in the last few years that excavations have really started up, and a lot of serious digs are going on, and the general picture is starting to come out, but it's still not clear. A lot of these small towns have never been excavated. A lot of places archaeologists have never even visited. So anyone who claims the absence of evidence is proof that David and Solomon didn't exist, in my opinion, is being foolish. Only a small fraction of the evidence has come out so far. It's more likely that grave diggers have ruined a site or looted it than it has been cataloged and excavated and published by archaeologists. Second, if there were periods of nomadic or semi-nomadic occupation, we would expect scant evidence. It would appear that there were just small towns scattered over the countryside. It doesn't look like a big kingdom, so they say there's no evidence. Now let's consider nomads for a moment. I want to discuss them and the various kinds of nomads. First, there are the hunter-gatherers. These people leave almost no record of their presence. They come, they hunt animals, they gather food, and they move on. The only evidence there is might be things like graffiti that they scratched on a rock or animal catchments. These are often called kites in the Middle East, and there is evidence they drove their herds of animals into these huge traps laid out on the countryside. Hundreds of these are in the desert in eastern Jordan. Rocks piled up so the animals were driven into a central place. Now, dating those kinds of nomads, hunter-gatherers, is very difficult. The second type of nomads are pastoralists. Usually they lived in tents made from animal skins or hair, and usually they lived off of their animals, eating the meat, drinking the milk, and so they leave behind a very limited archaeological record. They may leave some stone circles where they penned their animals overnight, or spots where they cleared the rocks away for their tents to be set up, and there are thousands of these spots all over the Jordanian landscape. Third and last, there are what are known as peripatetics. These are traveling craftsmen or entertainers or traders. Craftsmen such as metal workers moving from community to community, offering their services, sharpening or fixing or repairing metal items. I've seen these in Jordan even today, moving among the Bedouin. There are entertainers who move from various location to location, offering music or storytelling, poetry, and so forth. Peripatetics also included itinerant religious workers, such as prophets, preachers, priests who conducted offerings and offered sacrifices at various locations. I've even had some itinerant Muslim evangelists knock on my door when I lived in the Middle East. On the other hand, the peripatetic people also had some others, like gamblers or those who traded in women and so forth. So in every case, nomads are people who move from resource to resource. Often, they have a summer location and a winter location. Summer may be near fields that can be cultivated. Winter may involve taking animals to the grasslands or down to the desert. Sometimes the summer location's in a warmer place in the summer. When it grows cold there, the nomads move to a warmer location for the winter, usually down. This would be down to the Jordan Valley, down to the Dead Sea, down to the Araba, down to Wadi Rum, or down to Aqaba, and so forth, where it's warmer down there than up in the highlands. Now, why do they keep up their nomadic lifestyle? That's a question that people often ask because they don't understand the lifestyle of nomads. Nomads usually prefer the nomadic way of life. They consider themselves independent, separate, stress-free, even superior. One old Bedouin told me that their nomadic way of life was superior to the settled way. He insisted that our way of life was not sustainable. Electricity would come and go, oil would come and go, but the nomad remains. He summed it up with this statement. Today we graze our sheep on the ruins of the Greek, Roman, and Ottoman empires. Someday we will graze our sheep on the ruins of the British and the American empires. You see, nomads are in no rush to leave their tents and move into our hot, stifling buildings, which they think are much like prisons. So while nomads may have little of this world goods, they usually have a complex social structure, complex values, and a very strong social identity with clear tribal lines. They have oral traditions that are very important to them and which they enjoy. However, the pull of city lights often attracts young men who go off to the towns and the cities. But some return and many settle down and they continue the nomadic lifestyle. But for millennia, there have been a slow trickle of people from the nomads to the urban. So, what does all of this mean? Sometimes people, even historians, misread history because they see history through their own modern eyes, with their own modern values. I would encourage every historian everywhere to spend at least a year living among nomads to try to understand the world through their eyes. My wife and I and our 4 children lived for nearly 4 years in a small rural village surrounded by semi and nomadic Bedouin people. People said to us, "You can't take your teenage kids out there." But in the end, they loved it. They didn't really want to leave. Those were very good years. We tromped all over southern Jordan trying to figure out history through the eyes of the nomads and through the eyes of the settled people. Ever since then, I have no doubt and I have no trouble believing that a large group of pastoralist nomads, the Israelites, could have invaded the land of Israel and Jordan, and that their tribal leaders and their religious leaders could have lived there with limited archaeological footprint. But they did leave some things behind. And so in the next 6 videos, we're going to look at the archaeological evidence for the prophets and the people of their time. The first prophet we want to look at is Ayub, or Job as he's called in English. He's the earliest prophet of which we have a good record, so we will start with him in the next video. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.